Your anthology, if we looked at it, is probably absolutely hammered with notes, covered in notes for each poem. Well, you just can't dissect that and put just 20 minutes worth in the exam if you know the poem well. So what's the tactic to be able to just dissect it? And the tactic I will show you in this video is just to concentrate on 5 things per poem, 5 things per the other poem, and look what that does to my hands. It means I can interlink them perfectly to make my comparison. That's what you're going to do with your poems. What context do I put in? You become obsessed with context and you put loads of that in even when it's not relevant to the question. So I'm going to show you how to use just the right context to get what you need. How do you choose which bits to compare? You know, what makes a proper comparison? How do I structure it so that those comparisons actually go together coherently? What sort of introduction do I have and what sort of conclusion will I have? How do I wrap it all together so it looks like a neat whole? Okay, so let's imagine this is my question. Compare how power is portrayed in London and one other poem. I'm going to spend the first few minutes in the exam just checking out what I'm going to compare it with. Well, I've already decided it's going to be checking out my history. It could have been any of the others on our list. And now I've got to think, right, what was the poet's purpose in writing that poem? And I've got to link that to the key word in the question, which is power. Agard wants to show how an oppressed part of the population, Afro-Caribbeans, can achieve personal identity and gain the power to change how British society sees them and how they see themselves. Blake also writes a protest poem to persuade Londoners that British society, through the church, the monarchy and government, prevents them having freedom and from growing as individuals. Okay, now I clearly wouldn't write that in my plan, okay? I'm just showing you what's thinking is in my head. My plan would just include some key words. So I'm going to have the word oppression, I'm going to mention Afro-Caribbeans, and I always mention society no matter what the question, so that's there. And here we're talking about British society. Then in the same way, I'm going to look at the purpose of Blake. Well, he's trying to persuade, this case it's the British society again in London, and that they should be getting freedom. And the 3 things that I'm going to talk about are the church, the monarchy and government. So the words that I've underlined are probably the only ones that I will need. There might be 2 others that I'm going to draw your attention to here. This one is about personal identity, and that's going to be a similarity here because it's also therefore about individuals. Now this word individuals didn't come up by accident. It came up because I was thinking, how am I going to make what I say about London similar to what I'm saying about checking out my history? So I had to do something about identity, and individuals is going to lead me into that. Right, so now I've got 2 very detailed statements that I can write about both poems, and these are going to form my argument throughout the whole essay. Now I wouldn't write the word argument in my plan, but it's just so that you can see how I'm structuring my notes. So that's going to be an argument. At the minute, remember, I've only got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words in that plan, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 words in that plan. That's all I write down in my planning stage. The rest is in my head as I write my notes. Right, as you should know by now, my planning technique is B-O-O-S-E, boozy. So I'm going to start with the beginning of the poem, then I'm going to pick some sort of language technique. You have to check out my other video. I'll put an eye up here for you to see what these mean. But that's the structure I'm going to follow. So this liberates me. Let's have a look at checking out my history. Right, the reason it liberates me is I don't have to look at all the notes I've scribbled all over this because it's blank, and I'm just going to pick something that shows me this relationship of power. And I'm going to pick this, dem tell me what dem want to tell me. Okay, that's going to be my quotation. So that will be number 1. So number 1, Now again, I've written that here for you so you can see which quotation I'm going to use in the essay. But in the exam, I'm not going to write that out, am I? That would be stupid because it's already written. Remember, it was already written there. That's why I labelled it number 1, because then I know, oh right, that's the quotation I'm going to write about first. So in my plan here, I wouldn't write any of that. I would just write number 1, okay? And then I might say how that's going to link back to power. Well, I don't have to because I already know, but let me be explicit for you. So I'm talking about the power of dem, and that's going to link to British society, and it's going to link to the word in my plan, which was about being oppressed. So British society is oppressing. So the Afro-Caribbean society within British society is the victim of oppression because they're not taught their own history, they're taught someone else's history. So really easy for me to make those points. Right, now I have to go to my other poem, London, and do the same thing. Okay, well here I do exactly the same thing. I take a quotation from the beginning, which is going to be there. I wander through each chartered street, and I'm going to use that to make my comparison. So I'll write the quotation for you. So immediately I can make a comparison because this is about the speaker and this is also the speaker introducing themselves in the poem. So I can say both poets introduce themselves to make the story personal, and therefore that's going to help them make it personal to us. Here I'm going to choose that to signify the control and that to show the power of that control. So chartered means that London, each street, is owned by some figure of authority, which could be the church or the government or the military, however I'm going to do it. But the word each shows me that that is everywhere. It's the whole of London. So there's nothing left for the common man, for the individual. So both of these protest against what British society is doing to the individual. Now again, I'm not going to write all of that out. I'm just going to do what I did there, number 1. And that will correspond to the number 1 that I wrote on my poem. You can see it there, so I know which quotation I'm going to write about first. Okay, well next in Boozy, I've got to pick something that will be some sort of literary feature or language feature. I can pick anything from anywhere, and so I'm not going to worry, I'm just going to go through it. Well, I could pick this metaphor where the bandaged eye shows how his identity is bandaged up, so it's been damaged. I've got the word play, homophone of I, meaning the eye you see through, but also the I that is me, the personal identity, so I can write about that. I can talk about how history has damaged him because he's been blinded by British society, so he doesn't even know who he is because his history isn't even taught. Or I can jump ahead to this nursery rhyme type thing here, where Dick Whittington and he cat no dem never tell me about dat. So I could use this childish nursery rhyme to show how even in childhood, from the very earliest days, Afro-Caribbeans are oppressed by being given this simplified version of history, which is entirely white British, but excludes their own history, even when it's part of British history. These things are going to be easy for me to find, and I only have to write about one of them. So let's use the metaphor here of being damaged by British society, and that's going to be number 2. So in my plan, remember, for checking out my history, I'm not going to write that quotation out now, I'm just going to write 2 there because I know that's the one that I'm going to compare. My keyword might be oppression, and it's going to always be about British society or history, so I'll make sure that that's always a keyword that I'm going to mention. Well, I now know that I'm just going to find number 2 in London. Let's see what that will be. So when I was writing about checking out my history, I had something about damage and British society, So I'm now looking for something which is also some sort of damage. Well, I've got the repetition, haven't I, of every cry of every man in every infant's cry of fear. So I've got this repetition of cry, which I'm going to say is repetition, so I'll name the technique, and I'm going to link it to that feeling of being oppressed by a larger power that is affecting everybody. So here, number 2, and I'm just going to bring these across. I'm still going to talk about oppression. I'm still going to talk about British society. Oh, I do remember that the examiners want me to talk about literary techniques, so I'm going to remember to do that. So this one was a metaphor, and this one was repetition. So now what I want to point out to you is when I use this vocabulary, I'm always writing about the poet's purpose, and that's what's going to get my mark into the top band. But that is also what's going to help me construct an argument, because when I'm writing about the poet's purpose each time, I'm saying this is why the poem is structured as it is. This is why it's got the images in it that it has. It's because the poet is putting forward this argument, and it's an argument that I exemplified right at the beginning of my essay. So I hope you can see how easy it is to structure my plan. And remember, I don't have loads written. This bit here is the best example of what my plan will look like, okay? Because those, well, actually not even these, I'm not going to use those words. These are the only words that appear in that part of my plan with the number 2. In this part, I just had number 1. What were the words that appeared in my plan? They were just those, and they were just those, okay? So my plan includes very little, but I'm thinking about how to compare all the way through. Right, let's now look at the problem of context. Instead of getting overwhelmed with context, when I'm talking about British society and oppression and the oppression of authority in British society here, I'm automatically, sorry you can't see that now, can you? Those bits there. When I'm talking about those, I'm automatically dealing with context. So let me show you. This is as much as I would write. So Agard is interested in the Afro-Caribbean person growing up in Britain and being faced with the history of British society rather than their own. Blake is a revolutionary poet who wants to attack the British class system after the French Revolution that obviously got rid of the French class system. So you can see that I don't have to put loads of context in. I'm just going to mention any of this as it's relevant to talking about British society in both poems. Really easy to do. And I think of that just as an embedded quotation. In other words, I'm going to slip these tiny little bits of sentences in as I write. I'm not going to have big paragraphs at all. They're just tiny ideas that are scattered in my essay where they're relevant. And I don't have to keep mentioning those. I might only mention them once or twice. You know, I don't have to keep banging on about them. Next, I will want to have another language feature. I'm not going to show you that now. But of course, the other final missing ingredient is the structural bit that you've got to stick in. Well, what am I going to say that's sensible about the structure that links to the poet's purpose all the time? Well, I can easily look at this and say how the quatrains, these 4 lines are quatrains with the A-B rhyme scheme, mimic the kind of poetry that a child would have. Okay, that's fine, but how do I link that to the poet's purpose? Well, he wants everybody to understand his poem, no matter how illiterate they are. Remember, literacy wouldn't have been great in his day, and therefore people would also hear the poem, and he wants it to be memorable, therefore it follows a childlike structure. Okay, and that fits his purpose because he wants to reach as many people as possible so that he can encourage them to rebel against the government and the church and the monarchy. Right, well, now I come to checking out my history and look for another piece of structure that's similar or different that also shows me the poet's purpose. Well, luckily, I've got quatrains again, and this time the rhyme scheme is even more simple. A. They all rhyme together.
So I can make the same point about this being childlike, but it's this time not written to be memorable to people who can't read. It's written to remind us of childhood, because it's during the child's childhood that their sense of history and identity is created. And this is where they're taught the wrong history. You know, the nursery rhyme, the cow jumped over the moon, the dish ran away with the spoon. So here he's arguing that even our nursery rhymes create this version of history, but they hide the real part of their identity, that second part of their history, which is foreign and part of the Commonwealth, or here the West Indies. So I've got a structural comparison to make. I could, if I wanted, also mention how each character from history who's introduced is introduced in a much different form, just to show how different their history is to the British history that he's taught. So even the structure that explains that history has a different poetic form. Nice and easy to do, you see. Well, fair enough, but what would I have written in my plan? Well, you would have had me write the word quatrain, and I'll have to go and double check to see if it's got a double T. I'll do that in a minute. And then I would have talked about the nursery rhyme structure, and I would have talked about it being childlike. Sorry, that looks a bit like an S. And that would fit both poems. So that's all I'm writing there. And I might have a little bit of a difference here. So this one was because the audience didn't have literacy. They weren't very literate. But here it's rather about the experience of childhood. That's when identity is forged. So I'll have a little difference. But you can see that my plan, this is for the whole of my structure point, my structure paragraph. My plan is very little indeed. It's going to take me, 20 seconds to write that, 30 at the most. So now you know this, it has important implication for your revision. You will realise that actually you only need 10 quotations, and that's only 5 from each poem. One will be from the beginning of each, and you'll compare them. The next will be a language feature, and you'll compare those. Then there'll be another language feature, and you'll compare those. I haven't shown you the second one here, but if you're really stuck for time, that's the one that you can leave out. You must have a structure linked to the author's the poet's purpose, and you're going to compare those. Now that might be a quotation, or you might just name it. So my naming was the quatrain and the nursery rhyme style. I don't have to quote to prove that, I just call them it. And then finally I'm going to have quotations from the ending. Now the crucial thing all the way through is I'm trying to write an argument. Well, how did I make sure that I do that? I started with the author's purpose, the poet's purpose at the beginning. Yep, so that was my introduction. And then at the end, in my conclusion, I'm going to write about the purpose again. And that will always be revealed through the endings of the poem. So the new purpose at the ending of London is he's now no longer just attacking figures of authority. He's now attacking men who have been having sex with harlots, prostitutes, and therefore bringing plagues on the marriage, either emotional plagues through betrayal or actually physical plagues through sexually transmitted diseases. So he's attacking all his middle-class male readers here for indulging in illicit sex with prostitutes. So in checking out my history, he also has a wider purpose, but it's disguised. It looks like he's only talking about himself rather than society as a whole. I checking out my own history, I carving out my identity, but actually there is a real similarity because he's using his own personal experience there to tell other people of Afro-Caribbean descent to do the same as him. And we could also argue it is to warn the dominant British society, the white British society, if you like, that they need to allow this to happen. So it's a plea for teachers and schools to start teaching a wider version of history so that all their students have a sense of real identity. So this again is blaming wider society as a whole. So you can see how easy it is to structure your answer so you can get everything in and get full marks. even though you've only got about 20 minutes per poem. So there you have it. I hope that helps you get the very top marks. If you would like to try any of this, post it in a comment below, and you never know, I might make you a video. Thank you very much. Don't forget to subscribe, and see you soon on my channel.